Welcome back, everybody. I'm Tommy McCarthy, and this is Let's Talk Cyber. Well, no stranger to Let's Talk Cyber, Irene Coyle, Chief Operating Officer of OSP Cyber Academy. Welcome back, Irene.
Hi, thanks for having me back on your podcast.
Wonderful, Irene. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of our conversation today, interestingly, I want to share a little bit of a background on yourself. 30 years, Police Scotland. Data is no stranger to Irene Coyle. You've been involved in a multitude of data protection initiatives throughout your career in Police Scotland. So I think most notably the creation of the Vulnerable Persons Database, which is very pertinent to this podcast. One of your last tasks, I believe, was implementing GDPR throughout the recruitment function. A task you tell me you really enjoyed.
I do really enjoy it. I'm sad like that, but I'm passionate about data protection and GDPR, so it's important.
Well, unlike a lot of newcomers to the industry, Irene, it's fair to say that you've definitely put your hours in and the time in and had a lot of experience in understanding the implications of data protection and protecting vulnerable people's data. But interestingly, it's only data until it isn't. Well, let's ask a big question then, Irene. Why should organizations really care about data protection if they've never had a breach? So why is it so important to care about data protection?
Yeah, that's such a common question, Tommy. And quite often, or most commonly, I would say that I hear organizations saying is, well, we've never had a breach, so why do we need to invest in doing training or protecting the data more than what we currently do? And I can understand that mindset. However, when nothing has gone wrong, data protection can feel quite abstract for organisations, maybe feel a little bit procedural and a little bit like an admin function. But actually, data protection isn't about expecting disaster, so expecting that data breach. It's about understanding the value of that data that your organisation is processing. So every organisation holds personal data, whether it's your staff details, it's your payroll, it's your client information, it's contracts. And that data represents trust. And trust is something that you can build carefully over time. And I quite often hear organisations say, well, but we also wouldn't be a target for an attack. Why would anybody want to target the data that our organisation is processing? But you have to think about a lot of breaches that aren't actually targeting specific organisations. Are coming through third-party supplier attacks. So even if you're not a target, you have to think much wider about data protection and how your organisation's protecting it. So I always say, if your systems were disrupted tomorrow, would you know which data matters most? Would your team know what to do in that first hour? And that's what it's really about. It's about the foresight, not the fear of a data breach. It's actually thinking much bigger than that.
It doesn't always have to be a malicious attack that can affect big organizations. That's a point to consider. So I guess then, a lot of people still think that data protection is just about GDPR paperwork. Would you say that that's a fair representation?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. GDPR is the legal framework, but data protection is actually about how your organisation thinks and behaves with data. So I never ever treat it as a paperwork or a tick box exercise. That's the wrong idea of how you're thinking about data. It's about asking more sensible questions like, what data do we hold? Why do we hold it? Where does it actually sit within our infrastructure, and who's responsible for it? So policies, you hear about organisations saying, we've got a policy for this and we've got a policy for that. And policies are important, absolutely, but it's only written down. And if it's not acted upon, then it's pretty worthless, in my opinion. Why is it then more meaningful? You need to have structured training that matters, because your people are the ones that are fully protecting the data. It's not the paperwork that's protecting, actually, it's the people behind your organisation and behind these policies that are actually protecting it. So make it more meaningful in terms of, having structured training. That can make a real difference. And I always feel that if organisations invest in recognised training programs, so your NCSE assured training courses, like we've got a number of them, but your data protection practitioner courses, what that level of course does, it helps your organisation then focus on the right area, so that it's not just looking as a tick box GDPR paperwork exercise. It's moving that conversation from theory into practice. So it's about understanding lawful basis, recognising early breach indicators, your staff then knowing when to escalate, and to embed that accountability across your organisation, because it gives leaders then confidence that you're not just being compliant in your organisation for GDPR, the tick box paperwork exercise, but your organisation and the staff within it is being competent, and that's a significant difference.
But then you touched on risk there. So when organizations think about risk, they often think about fines. Is that the real concern here, that a risk is associated to a fine, or is there more that they need to consider?
So I think it depends if you're the chief financial officer or the CEO, actually, but fines are a visible part and they are going to hurt organisations. But reputation is actually got the deeper impact for an organisation. So when personal data is being mishandled, the message that people are hearing is, you didn't protect me. That's what they hear. They don't hear about the fine and the amount of money that that organisation is having to pay. They're actually hearing, well, you didn't protect me. And that affects confidence. Now, whether that's with your customers, with your own staff, or even your partners that you're working with. So data protection is ultimately about trust. It's not about those fines. It's actually about trust. And I do believe that trust sits firmly at leadership level. So it's strategic and it's about the message that has to land with your leadership team. So we need to stop saying, oh, data protection's entirely the DPO's job. It's not just the DPO. It's exactly the same as saying that cybersecurity is IT's job. It's not. It's everybody's job. And that should be the same way that you look at data protection, to build that trust, build that confidence, and not focusing on just getting a fine as a result of not doing that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when I looked into that freedom of information
Northern
breach,
Ireland.
yeah, there's now 5,000 members of the workforce out of the 9,500 that now are taking legal action against
Yeah.
their own police force as a result of that data breach that occurred. So
Yeah,
I
it's
get,
important. Yeah, it's their data. It's important. And, the risks that were exposed to those individuals in that setup in Northern Ireland is very unique and different to police officers in other areas across the UK. So it is really important. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I guess then that leads me on to my next question is, can you share a real life example that highlights why knowing where your data is across your organization is really so important? I mean, I think that's the issue here. If the individual that mistakenly shared that information in Northern Ireland was aware of where the data was and where it was sitting, there's a likelihood that would never have happened. So can you give us a real life example of how important it
Yeah.
is?
And I think you've raised a very valid point there, Tommy. It's not about people maliciously taking action that hurts the data. It's actually genuinely, normally human error that's actually doing that. So folk aren't always, obviously cyber attacks are completely different. That is targeted and they are wanting to cause harm and damage. But a lot of the time it is human error, as you said. If I think it's not a current one, but from 2018, the Marriott Hotel Group, they disclosed that they had a breach that affected 339 million guest members' records worldwide. So it wasn't even just in a niche area, it was worldwide. But the part that's often overlooked is actually that the breach originated in a booking system from Starwood Hotels Group. And that was a company that Marriott actually acquired. So the attackers had gained access years earlier, but had remained undetected, which is quite commonplace. Maybe not so much now when the technology is catching up with detection tools. So when the ICO investigated, the focus wasn't just about the cyber intrusion into Marriott Hotel. It was about their governance and the due diligence that they did or didn't do in this case. So what the ICO or the regulator concluded was that Marriott had not undertaken sufficient assessment of the systems that they were now acquiring through the Starwood Hotel Group and what personal data was on that and on those systems. So putting it in really, really simple terms, Tommy, they didn't fully map the data, they didn't assess the data, and they didn't secure the data environment that they had now inherited. So that's why they got a whopping big fine of just over £18 million. I think it's £18.4 million. So beyond that financial impact, there was global scrutiny and reputational damage as a result of that particular data breach. So I always try and highlight, well, what was the lessons learned there? So the lessons from that example, Maria, is you cannot protect what you cannot see. The data mapping is not an administrative task. It's about visibility. So you need to know where your data is to be able to then protect your data. So especially if you're using legacy systems, pre-GDPR, if you're going through acquisitions, if you've got suppliers heavily involved in the data processing or any internal platforms, then if you don't know exactly what data is in those systems, then you're operating effectively with blind spots. And blind spots,
Easy for you to say.
spots where the risk grows very quietly.
Yeah, and it's interesting you touched on something there that was on the tip of my tongue and I was desperate to interrupt, but I thought, no, I'll wait my turn. Growth through acquisition. When organizations acquire, competitors or potential companies that can add value, they're in most cases left in the dark to understand exactly what kind of data they are inheriting, whether or not that data is secure, who's got access to it. So it's that whole raft of data protection issues that need to be considered. And it's on that point, what I really want to ask is, what should the leaders out there that are listening to this podcast today, what should they really focus on right now? What is the priority for them?
Yeah, well, I'd keep it very, very simple. The first thing that they should be focusing on is clarity. So know what data your organization holds and how it flows through the organization, whether it's just internal or if it's internal and external. The second thing to focus on is accountability. So make ownership visible, not assumed. And the third one is about culture. So most data breaches reported in the UK do involve the human element, so human error that we mentioned a couple of times, Tommy, during this podcast. Whether it's just an email sent to the wrong recipient, which we've seen lots and lots of times, a spreadsheet that's been attached incorrectly or not protected, or even down to simply when somebody leaves your organisation and you're not removing the access for that individual. So none of those examples that I've just said there are a technology problem, it's an awareness problem. So when people understand why data matters, they will behave differently. And then when leadership support the structure, the high quality data protection training, especially if it's aligned to NCSC and the principles behind that, then that as a leader will strengthen both your organization's competence and your organization's confidence. And so that's the kind of three things that I would say for a leader you should be focusing on. So clarity, accountability, and culture. That's the three things that they should be looking at.
And without a doubt, all really valuable considerations, because at the end of the day, your people are your final line of defense. We hear that all the time, and more so now than ever because of the technology that's being implemented. I need to wind this up with a takeaway. What would you like the listeners to take away from this podcast? So give me the most important thing that you think the listeners should be thinking about in relation to what we've discussed today.
Yeah, I would say data protection shouldn't feel overwhelming. It's not about perfection, absolutely not. It's about preparation. So behind every data record is an individual, whether it's you, Tommy, or myself, whether it's a customer, a colleague, or a member of the public. So when that information's mishandled, what's damaged isn't just data, it's the trust. That's the kind of key message here. But most of what we've been talking about today is preventable. So with visibility, with accountability, and with the right training in place. And good governance is definitely not dramatic. It should actually feel uneventful if you're doing it right. If you've got good governance in place, it should feel uneventful. And that's a really good sign. So remember, the goal isn't headlines, it's steady confidence, because it's only data until it isn't.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. That's a great way to wind this podcast up, because ultimately you're relying heavily on your people here to understand the implication of how important all the data you hold is to the organization, but more importantly to the data subjects, which is the thing that most people forget. We are the police force of the data that we hold on behalf of our clients, our employees, our customers. So we need to respect the value that data has to us and to them. So Irene, that was a great way of winding up the podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in Glasgow at the Cyber UK. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Irene Coyle.
Come along and see me.
Wonderful, Irene. Thank you so much for joining. Let's Talk Cyber.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Tommy.